Hello everyone, it's the Motorcycle Muse here, and in this video I'm going to explain how a motorcycle transmission or a motorcycle gearbox works. So I've essentially opened up this particular engine, so I have removed the left hand side of the crankcase so that you can take a look at the transmission, which consists of all these shafts here. So this is essentially the rear of the motorcycle engine. This is the front of the motorcycle engine where we have the crankshaft assembly. So anything behind the crankshaft assembly, which is all these shafts and gears here, they're all part of the transmission. Now it looks like a complete mess of shafts and gears and pieces of metal, and it looks like it's very complicated to understand, but essentially it's not. It's actually, once I break it down for you, I think you're going to find that it's actually quite easy to understand. So first of all, let's discuss the main components of the gearbox, and then I'll demonstrate how it actually works with the engine separated as so. So first of all, we have our input shaft. So this is this shaft here. So the input shaft, if we turn it around, normally on the other side, this is the input shaft. So the input shaft normally holds the clutch. I've removed the clutch from this particular motorcycle engine, and also the input shaft is acted on by the crankshaft. So the crankshaft is connected to the piston. And as the piston is going up and down when the engine is being run, as the burn is going on in the cylinder, it's driving the piston up and down. Now I've removed the intermediate gears, but there is intermediate gears that connect the crankshaft to the input shaft, or the clutch essentially, and cause the input shaft to rotate when it's engaged, or when the engine is running. So when the input shaft is rotating, now if the motorcycle is in gear, the input shaft will act on this shaft here, which is called the output shaft. And on the end of the output shaft, normally you will find the front sprocket. On a chain-driven motorcycle, you will find the front sprocket here, which will have the chain, which is connected to the rear wheel, or supplies power to the rear wheel through the rear sprocket. So the input shaft acting on the output shaft, which is this shaft here, is essentially how we get our motorcycle to run. And that's when the motorcycle is in gear. So currently this particular engine is in 5th gear. If the gearbox was in neutral and the input shaft was rotating, then the output shaft, you would see, would not rotate. So this one would stay still and the input shaft would be rotating if the engine was running. So that's the input shaft and the output shaft. We have some intermediate shafts, which is this one here and this one here. You might not find intermediate shafts or intermediate gears on all gearboxes. On a lot of the Honda engines that I've looked at, essentially you will have an input shaft. You may only have an input shaft and an output shaft, and there may be no intermediate gears or intermediate shafts. So we can take it for the moment that these two shafts here are just, they contain intermediate gears, or connecting gears. So they might not be as important. Next we can take a look at the shift drum, which is this quite large shaft here. And then it acts on the forks, which are here, and there's 3 forks, and they sit on this shaft here. And then I'll explain that in a little bit more detail in a minute, but the shift drum is able to rotate. So it can rotate clockwise or anti-clockwise depending on whether you're going up and down the gears, and it is acted on by the gear change mechanism. So this is the end of this shaft here is for the gear change mechanism. Normally the lever that you would change the gear with is at your left foot on most motorcycles, on a manual gearbox motorcycle. You will shift into first gear by pushing down once on the shifter with your left foot, and it will cause this shaft to rotate. Now when this shaft rotates, you can see on the other side it acts on the gear change mechanism. So it's this shaft here, so this is the shaft here, and it acts on this gear change mechanism. So the gear change mechanism, essentially just pull that out a little, you can see it here. So this is the other end of the shift drum. So it has a number of poles, and essentially the gear change mechanism, when we push down, it moves downwards and it acts on the poles, and it causes the shift drum to rotate. So we can shift it upwards or downwards and cause the shift drum to rotate clockwise or counterclockwise. So essentially we can move it that way or can move it this way. Okay, so that's how we shift gear. So coming back here, so let's go ahead and disassemble the gearbox or the transmission first of all. So I can remove this intermediate gear here first of all. So let's remove this one. I just push it out. So that's it. That's the first intermediate gear. Nothing too special about that. I can remove the gear change mechanism just to get it out of the way. So it's actually, I can just pull it out here. So that's my gear change mechanism, which is just this piece here. That's it. So I can now remove the shift drum. Okay, and it is held on just on this side here. So the shift drum, I just need to undo this little bolt here. So I just remove this bolt. Remove the bolt. There is a little spring, return spring here acting on it, so I just disconnect it. There we go. So that's that piece here. So with that removed, I can just turn it back around again. So now I can remove the shift drum. I can just pull it out. Just be careful. Okay. So there's our shift drum removed. I can now remove the rest of the gearbox. I can just turn it up on its side, like so. So all these shafts and gears are all meshed up together. So when I remove them as one unit, So I'll just remove that shaft. It's just one big long metal bar. And I can just remove this gear here. Okay, just to get that out of the way for a second, I can remove this from the intermediate gear. I just want to move this shift fork out of the way for a second. So I just take out that shift fork for a second, and that allows me to remove this shaft. I can now put the shift fork back in, as I want to keep it in order. And I can put this back on. So that's our intermediate gear. So I'm now left with my input shaft, my output shaft, and the 3 shift forks. So I want to remove this all as one unit, ensuring that I don't mix up the shift forks. So I'm just going to turn it upside down briefly. It's just going to make it easier to get it out. I'm just tapping on the input shaft. The whole unit should just come out together as one. So that's it out. I can lay that down so that I can keep the order. So just leave it down just for a second, and let's put this part of the crankcase so it's not going to be falling over the whole time. And I can also remove this part here, which is the end of the input shaft, and it contains a little thrust washer, so I'll just put that back on. Okay, so with the shafts all removed from the engine casing, let's go ahead and disassemble the gear pinions, the dogs, and the shift forks from the actual shafts. So I'll start here with the input shaft. So let me just move that out. This is the position that they normally sit in when they're installed on the engine. So I'll just remove, this is the shift fork. Okay, so the shift fork, normally it sits in here, and its job is when it's moving up and down on its own shaft. So there's a little shaft here that it sits on, and it shifts up and down on this shaft. So essentially it determines, depending on where that shift fork is, it determines which gear is engaged. So it moves essentially the dog to connect up with the other dogs, or gear pinions, and shift gear. So the shift fork is controlled by the shift drum. So this is the shift drum here. As you can see, it's just basically a bit of a metal cylinder, and it has a number of grooves in it. And what happens is the shift fork sits, there's little metal protrusion here on the shift fork, and it sits in the shift drum, like so. It sits in the groove of the shift drum, and as the shift drum is rotated, so the gear shift mechanism acts on this section here of the shift drum and causes it to rotate. So when it rotates, so let's just see it here, let's just rotate it. It causes the shift fork to follow the groove. So as the shift drum rotates, you can see that the groove moves either to the left or to the right. So as the shift drum rotates, it causes the shift fork to move to the right in this particular case. And as you can see, the two other grooves, they're actually straight lines at this section. So let me just put that back here. So you can see that it's two straight lines here. So there's no movement on the other two shift forks sit in here on the shift drum. And as it rotates, it only moves the middle fork. As it rotates again for the next gear, we can see that eventually the shift drum causes the fork on the left hand side, this one here let's say, to actually move to the left, while the other two stay in the middle. And then it moves it back and moves the other shift fork to follow this groove here, which moves to the right. So that's how the shift drum works. The little grooves in the shift drum, as it rotates, causes the shift forks to move left or right. And when they move left or right, they cause the dogs that they're engaged with to move left or right and engage different gear pinions. So let's go ahead, let's remove that shift fork. Let's just put it down for a second here. Just put it there just so I can remember the way it goes up. So I'll start on this side here, on the left hand side. So I have a little washer which is actually holding it on. It's actually quite tight fit. I'll just move it around here and it'll come off eventually. There we go. It's caught in a little groove actually. I'm just moving that little washer around until, okay, there we go. Okay, I don't want it to go back into place. There we go. So there's our washer. So I'll put the pieces to one side, just there. Next up, I'm going to remove this gear pinion here, and I'm going to stack them up so that I know the order in which they go. Now this particular gear pinion, it has, if you see here, it can actually catch the shaft, the splines. So it has inner splines and it has outer splines. So the inner splines are for catching the actual shaft. So the shaft itself has splines. So any gear pinions that have inner splines will rotate with the shaft, and any gear pinions that don't have splines, inner splines, will not rotate with the shaft. So this one here, we can see this has no inner splines because it's rotating independent of the shaft. Okay, so just take that one off. We have a little washer here, and this is a splined washer. So place that in order, it's fine. Now here we have a spring washer, so I'm just going to use a little special pliers for removing the spring washer. Okay, so there we go. That's our spring washer. Like so. Next up we have another dog, and this one, it is double-sided. It has dogs on two sides, and this is where the shift fork sits, just in there in the middle of that. Okay, so I just need to know the order that goes in. So that's it there. This dog here, our gear pinion, rotates independent of the shaft, so it has no splines on the inside. It's held on with a little spring washer itself, so I need to just remove that spring washer. Okay. The spring washers essentially hold the dogs in place, stop them moving up and down in the shaft, or restrict their movement. So this one comes off. It has a little washer in front. Put that to one side, in the right order. So again, just to demonstrate, you can see that the splined dogs, or the dog with the splines, interacts with a dog that has no splines on the inside. But what this one does is have splines on the outside, and they are engaging with gears on the outside, probably on the other shaft, which is the output shaft. Okay, so when they're not engaged, they rotate independently of each other. But when they are engaged, this brings the shaft with it, because it has the splines on the inside. Okay, so put that back in order. Okay, and then on this side here, this is where the clutch sits. Essentially, we have the seat for the clutch, and then we just have another little spacer washer. So I can put that there. And that's our input shaft. As you can see, it does have some splines on it, built into it, or a gear built into it. So this is one solid piece of metal. You can also notice that there's a couple of holes, little tiny holes in it, in the shaft, and they're to allow oil to circulate. So the oil goes down the shaft and it comes out through these little holes here, and it lubricates the whole, all the gears in the transmission. So that's our input shaft. I'll put that to one side for the moment. We can now move on to the output shaft. So I'll just put that there, because that's the order in which that goes. So in the output shaft, we have two shift forks engaged. So I'm just going to remove the two shift forks, but I need to remember the order in which they go. Okay, I don't want to be turning them upside down when I'm putting it back in. I don't want to be moving this one over to the wrong side. I need to know the order in which they go. So I'll just put them to the side for the moment. Okay, so let's start removing the washers here on the left hand side. So we just have a little spacer washer. We have our gear pinion, comes off like so. It is acted on by this gear pinion with dogs on it. So the dogs are the little protrusions, and the gear pinions are the ones with the splines on the outside. Okay, so this particular gear pinion with the dogs, it has splines on the inside, so it engages with the shaft. So this gear here rotates independent because it has no splines on the inside. So it rotates independent of the shaft, but it is engaged with the input shaft through these splines here. And essentially it rotates independent, but once it's shifted into gear, you can see here that the dogs engage with the, so there it is, that's how it engages this gear here. So the dogs engage inside the gear pinion rather than engaging more dogs on the other side. Okay, so that's the order in which that goes. Just move it over so I don't mix up the two shafts. Okay, so next up we are going to remove another dog here. Let me just see what way is this engaged. Okay, so this dog, or this gear pinion, cannot come off because it's the shaft is a little bit thicker on this side. So I need to turn my attention to this side and start disassembling it from the right hand side. So we have one washer, we have a large metal spacer, and basically like a thick washer, and another little small washer, remembering the order in which they go. I have a gear pinion, which again has cavities in the middle of it, or in the middle section of it. I can see here that I can't take this gear pinion with the dogs off as it's held on. So I just put that there for a second. Let's take a look. We have a little washer, first of all. So once that washer is off, we can disengage this gear pinion, which has the dogs, and it also this is the one that's acted on by the shift fork, so it has a spacer for the shift fork to move it right and left. Okay, and this one engages here. Now, we have a little spring washer here, which I need to remove. Off comes the spring washer. Put that in order. There's a little spacer washer. Just here, which has little splines on it. So it goes in that order. And there we have the gear pinion with the dogs. So again, this one has no splines on the inside, whereas the one that it engages with does have splines on the inside. And once again, we are left here with our output shaft. If we just rotate it around, we can see that it's of a different thickness and different areas of the actual shaft, but it's one solid piece of metal. We can also note that there is little holes here for the oil, which again goes down through the middle of the shaft and comes out through these little small holes to allow the oil to circulate through the gears and the transmission and keep it all lubricated. And the oil basically eliminates or reduces wear on the gearbox over time. So let's go ahead and put this all back together, and we'll put the input shaft and the output shaft, the intermediate shafts, the shift drum, the shift forks all back into the engine, and we will demonstrate how it all works. So with the gearbox reassembled in the right hand half of the engine, I can now demonstrate how it actually works. So at the moment I have the engine, or the gearbox, is in neutral. So when I twist on the input shaft, on the right hand side and I turn it anti-clockwise, you can see that some of the dogs are moving, some of the gear pinions are moving, but the output shaft is not rotating. And the reason for that is that none of the dogs are engaged with any of the gear pinions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the shift drum anti-clockwise one turn. Okay. So what you'll have noticed here is that the dogs from this gear pinion have engaged with the dogs on the other side of it. So on the output shaft. So now when I turn anti-clockwise, the dogs have engaged just here. And now we can see that the output shaft is rotating. Now, if you keep an eye on the other dogs on the input shaft, so we have dogs here, a set of dogs there, and a set of dogs here, they are not engaged, so they are still independent or rotating independently. So the only dog that is engaged is this one here, or this pair, on the output shaft. So this is first gear. So I can now rotate the shift drum back clockwise, one small rotation, and that's back in neutral. So as you can see, the dogs disengaged on the output shaft, and we're now back in neutral. So now I'm going to go ahead and just turn the shift drum clockwise one more turn, and this should bring it from neutral into second gear. So you can see here that this gear pinion has, on the output shaft, instead of moving this way to the left to engage first gear, it is now moved to the right to engage second gear. And once I turn on the input shaft, I can see that the output shaft is now rotating again. So I've now shifted it into third gear. And as you can see, this dog here has engaged with this gear pinion on the output shaft. And as I act on the input shaft, the output shaft is rotating. Now I'm going to act on the shift drum again, turning it clockwise one more turn. So having shifted it into fourth gear, the dog here on the input shaft has engaged with this gear pinion. And you can see that when I act on the input shaft, the output shaft is rotating. Now I can go one more gear. So I can go one more gear up into 5th gear by rotating the shift drum one more time. And as you can see, the shift drum acted on this dog here on the left hand side of the input shaft, and it has engaged another gear pinion. And now when I rotate the input shaft, the output shaft is rotating. A little bit easier there now. So then, to go back down through the gears, I rotate the shift drum in the opposite direction. So that's it. That's how the gearbox works in a motorcycle engine.